Most people say a store went out of business. The people who actually grew up inside one, they lost their childhood paradise. East Tennessee, early 1970s. A 15-year-old in a rural holler has a problem that the geography of his life has no obvious solution for. He wants to understand electronics, not as a curiosity, as a vocation. The hunger for it specific and focused. What isn't available is anyone to teach him, or anywhere to start. There's no electronics teacher at his school. The nearest city is a real drive. Specialty retail in rural America in 1970 means a hardware counter at a general store, a farm supply shop, occasionally a Sears catalog that runs deep enough into tools to be almost useful. Then the RadioShack catalog arrives. He finds the voltmeter he needs on its pages, a micronta, analog needle, the instrument that makes electricity legible. He takes it to the store. Somehow, it gets from that page into his hands. The needle swings. He's 15 years old, and for the first time, the invisible world of electrical current is no longer invisible. It's measurable, interpretable, his. He will spend the next 40 years teaching electronics. When that man described this sequence in the comment section of a RadioShack video, 117 people clicked the like button. 10 wrote replies. None of them were there to correct a timeline. They were there because they recognized the story as their own. Different holler, different catalog page, different instrument, same inflection point. The moment when the world opened up and revealed that it could be understood, and that the understanding was available to them specifically. That comment section isn't a product review. It's a census of an infrastructure that no longer exists. RadioShack was founded in Boston in 1921 as a mail-order operation for amateur radio operators. Charles Tandy of Fort Worth, Texas, acquired the struggling chain in 1963. At the time, it was near bankruptcy, and redirected it toward consumer electronics and the do-it-yourself market. By 1977, RadioShack had 3,500 stores across the United States. By the mid-1980s, the number had reached 7,000. For the better part of 2 decades, those stores, in malls, strip centers, and small-town commercial blocks, were the most accessible gateway to technical knowledge that America had ever built at scale. No university admission required, no technical background assumed, no prior credentials. Just a door, a counter, and a person behind it who actually knew what they were talking about. Most people say a store went out of business. The people who grew up inside one know they lost something different. An infrastructure for curiosity with no equivalent replacement. Before you could get to the store, there was the catalog. RadioShack published its first in 1939. 25,000 copies, aimed at schools, laboratories, and the industrial market. By the 1970s, the catalog had evolved into something altogether different. An annual publication, mailed to customers who'd given their address at RadioShack stores, that functioned as both a product guide and a proof of concept. Proof that this entire world of circuits and components and test equipment was real, documented, priced, and available to the person holding the paper. The 1977 edition ran to 164 pages. The 1983 edition, catalog number 314, had grown to 184 pages, archived today and available for browsing. The 1988 edition also ran to 184. Earlier editions from the 1960s reportedly exceeded 300 pages in some years. One account references a catalog of some 500 pages from an earlier era, a physical object substantial enough to need introduction when shown to someone who'd never seen one. These weren't thin promotional mailers. They were reference volumes. The delivery mechanism was the address collection policy that RadioShack customers came to recognize as one of the store's defining quirks. At every transaction, including the purchase of a single 9-volt battery, RadioShack employees asked for the customer's name and address. This practice, documented in multiple independent accounts, served one purpose: building the mailing list. Your address went on file at the counter, and months later, the new catalog appeared in your mailbox at home. For a family in rural East Tennessee, or a working-class neighborhood in Cleveland, or a small Iowa town well outside any major retail corridor, this was the mechanism by which RadioShack extended its reach beyond its 4 walls. The catalog arrived at your kitchen table. It told you what was possible before you'd arranged to get there. People remember the physical weight of it. The covers shifted with the decade. CB radios dominated the mid-1970s editions. Home computers took over by 1977, the TRS-80 appearing for the first time on catalog pages that same year the machine launched. By the early 1980s, the cover art was all keyboards and monitors. Each edition was a reliable record of where the country's technical imagination had moved. A researcher who surveyed the archive described it as tracking America's tech evolution, with each year's cover functioning as a thermometer for the moment. The names inside the catalog were their own vocabulary: realistic for audio, FM/AM radios, boomboxes, scanners, CB equipment, intercoms. The 1970 edition described realistic products in the language of genuine engineering specification. FM/AM radios with manual or crystal option tuning. These weren't toy versions of real equipment. A realistic scanner was real equipment. A realistic receiver was real equipment. The name was chosen deliberately to signal authenticity and practical performance. Micronta for test instruments. The VOM, volt-ohm meter, is the instrument that makes electricity legible. Plug the probes in, set the range, touch the leads to a circuit, and the needle tells you what's happening. Vintage Micronta multimeters from the 1970s still appear in hobbyist forums today, still functional, still used. A 40-year product lifecycle for a house brand test instrument from a strip mall electronics chain isn't an accident. It's the evidence of a culture that took the tools seriously. Archer for components, the raw material. Resistors by the assorted bag. Capacitors, transistors. Hookup wire by the spool. Connectors. The stuff you needed once you'd read the schematic, understood it, and needed the physical objects to make it real. Science fair for the educational kits, which is its own story and will get its own section. People describe the ritual of the catalog with a consistency that crosses demographics, decades, and geography. A Reddit user writing about his late 1970s childhood. I could lose hours just paging through the old RadioShack catalog and making future buying plans. Future buying plans, not current purchases. The catalog was the site of aspiration. The things you intended to own, the projects you planned to build, the capabilities you intended to acquire. Children paged through it the way an earlier generation went through the Sears wish book. But the RadioShack catalog arrived not just at Christmas. It arrived whenever the store had your address, and it carried an implicit argument on every page. This is the world of electronics. Here is what it costs, and none of it's beyond you. Two separate commenters, writing independently without prompting about RadioShack memories, described the catalog's smell. Not its contents, not its prices, its smell. That's a specific behavioral marker in memory research. Olfactory recall is the most direct pathway to autobiographical memory. When two people, typing in separate houses without comparing notes, reach for the same sensory detail unprompted, they're describing an experience that left a genuine neurological trace. The catalog smelled like possibility, encoded in paper and ink, and the smell stayed. The vintage audio community captured the catalog's staying power in a forum discussion. In researching an early cassette player I found all of the old RadioShack catalogs online. It's interesting to look at the evolution of electronics, original costs. Other members in the same thread described drooling over the radios in those pages for years before they could afford one. The aspiration was the experience. The purchase was years away. The catalog was now. One documented community memory, the 1983 computer catalog, with equipment priced at thousands of dollars for a few kilobytes of memory, thousands for a daisy wheel printer. The person who wrote that still had the catalog, not the equipment, the catalog. Which is the point. The catalog outlasted the technology it described by decades because it was never just a product listing. It was a record of what someone believed was possible for you. The 1998 catalog, later in the company's life, but still speaking with institutional authority, opened with the line, "Since 1921, Americans have looked to RadioShack for innovative electronics, a superb selection of parts and accessories, plus information and advice." The key word is the last one, advice. RadioShack wasn't describing price, It was describing access to knowledge that had no other retail distribution point. Heathkit existed, serious kits for serious hobbyists, mail order, premium. Allied Radio was out there. Lafayette Radio published a catalog. But none of them had 7,000 physical storefronts. None of them had an employee who could hand you a schematic and walk you through it on a Tuesday afternoon. The catalog was RadioShack's promise. The store was where the promise got kept. RadioShack published its catalog from 1939 through approximately 2003, when the last full consumer print edition went out. That's over 60 years of arriving in American mailboxes. The digital archive, at RadioShackCatalogs.com, holds flip-through versions of dozens of editions. People still visit it. Not to find part numbers, to browse, to move at the speed their childhood moved through those pages. The catalog introduced you to the possibility. The science fair kits were where you tested it against reality. RadioShack introduced the science fair brand in 1969 with an explicit institutional mission. A series of do-it-yourself experimental kits aimed at educating both children and adults in electronics, physics, magnetism, computers, aerospace. Not just children, adults too. Not just electronics, physics, magnetism, computers, aerospace. RadioShack wasn't positioning science fair as a toy line. It was building a curriculum without a school. The kits ran in a progression that functioned almost like academic advancement. The 50-in-1 electronic project kit, catalog number 201, built 50 working circuits, germanium radios, transistor amplifiers, a light-operated Morse code key. The 100-in-1, documented in community archives from as early as 1973, came with what one account describes as a giant instruction booklet that placed a different project on every page, schematic alongside description. The 150-in-1, available by 1976, extended the range to radio circuits, sound effects generators, timers, a lie detector circuit, a solar light meter, a metal detector. The 200-in-1, catalog number 28-265, came with a manual described as big as the box itself. 6 AA batteries, no soldering required. That last detail is the philosophical one. The science fair kits used spring clip wire connections rather than solder joints, a deliberate design decision so that a 10-year-old without a workbench or safety supervision could build something that actually worked. No special skills, no special equipment. The spring terminals held, the circuits functioned. The point wasn't the construction method. The point was the working circuit. The manuals were real educational documents. Science fair kits came by multiple documented accounts with large, nicely printed manuals and booklets of interesting circuit schematics, each accompanied by design notes. The 200-in-1 manual was comprehensive enough to teach the underlying principles alongside the specific projects. RadioShack also published, separately from the kits, a series of electronics books that sold over 7 million copies. The commitment to education was structural, not incidental. The Crystal Radio Kit occupied its own category. It appeared in the RadioShack catalog under multiple numbers across different years. 28-207, 28-177, others depending on the era, and vintage examples still sell for $50 or $60 on the resale market. No one who owned one as a kid is selling it for the money. The Crystal Radio requires no power source. You build the coil, connect the antenna, attach the earpiece, and if you've done it right, a voice comes to you from miles away, carried by nothing you can see. The signal powers itself. For a child encountering this for the first time, it's the moment physics stops being abstract. Not physics as something that happens in textbooks, physics as something that does something for you, specifically, right now, in your bedroom, with parts you assembled from a cardboard box. Ham radio oral histories, community forums, and educational memoirs independently document the Crystal Radio as the project that changed the direction of lives. Because what it proves isn't just that electronics work. It proves that you can work with electronics. That the invisible electromagnetic world isn't locked behind credentials. One community member described the 150-in-1 as a gateway drug to building your own pirate radio station. The exaggeration contains the fact. The kits didn't just teach skills, they taught the student what was possible with those skills. The progression from 50-in-1 to 100-in-1 to 150-in-1 to 200-in-1 wasn't about numbers climbing. It was about a world opening up in stages, each project revealing a door the previous one had concealed. The RadioShackCatalogs.com archive lists the full science fair line: crystal radio kit, lie detector kit, metal locator kit, fire alarm kit, FM wireless microphone kit, electronic songbird kit. Each of those names is a proof of membership signal to anyone who grew up with them. You don't need the specs explained, you just need to hear the name. Walk into RadioShack in 1978. Approach the counter with a circuit board that isn't working, or a project kit that's throwing you, or a schematic you can't parse. The person behind the counter had almost certainly spent their first weeks on the job working through multiple 50-page training manuals. Not as a suggestion, as a documented requirement for pay raises and promotion. Employees who passed product type certification tests were eligible for raises. The expectation was clear: certifications within roughly 6 weeks of hire. The Tandy Corporation called its compensation model institutionalized entrepreneurship. Successful employees could earn up to 10 times their base salary through bonuses and profit sharing. 60 Tandy employees eventually became millionaires through the program. That's a remarkable figure for a consumer retail chain staffed by people whose job description included helping a confused teenager understand why his LED wouldn't light. The financial stake changed the culture of knowledge. An employee with profit sharing tied to performance had a genuine reason to understand the products. Not to read the box, to understand the product. Former accounts described training manuals covering inverters, remote control cars, computers, the full range of what the store stocked. The expectation was that any experienced clerk could piece together components to solve a customer's actual technical problem. Not locate a SCUC, solve the problem. Our employees started it all with their excellent knowledge of electronics and a willingness to share it with their customers, reads RadioShack's own 1998 catalog introduction. A later document, but one that understood what the culture had been built on and named it explicitly. From the customer side, this showed up as something difficult to articulate without sounding sentimental. Employees took a lot of pride in how much they knew. That observation, posted in a comment section about RadioShack, generated nearly 80 engagement units from people who recognized it immediately, who had stood at that counter as a confused kid and felt, afterward, that something had transferred. Not just a product, an understanding. Another former employee broke down the training system in concrete terms: the certification timeline, the product categories tested, the compensation linked to passing. That comment generated 55 likes and 3 replies from people confirming the same experience from the inside. MIT Press, in its academic study of RadioShack's user culture, described the institutional expectation plainly. The RadioShack employee was someone who had all the knowledge. Ham radio operators, technically sophisticated hobbyists, would sometimes deliberately walk into RadioShack and probe an employee's electronics knowledge, not to embarrass anyone, to verify. Documented accounts of the era suggest they usually found what they were looking for. This is the detail that surprises people who only knew RadioShack in its decline. The 1970s and early 1980s employee culture wasn't generic retail. It was a compensated, trained, incentivized staff whose paycheck was partially contingent on knowing things. When a kid walked in with a broken kit and a confused look, the employee who helped him was helping him with something that directly affected his own livelihood. The store's expertise was designed, not accidental. A kid who walked in not knowing what he needed could walk out knowing what he had. Not just with a product in his hand, with a mentor, briefly, at a counter. On August 3, 1977, RadioShack placed the TRS-80 Model 1 in 3,500 stores simultaneously. Launch price, $599. At that same moment, the Apple II was selling for $1,298. The Commodore PET 2001 was approaching similar territory. The TRS-80 was the most affordable, complete, pre-assembled home computer that year. A distinction that mattered enormously in 1977, when most people who encountered computing did so in offices, universities, or through kit-build hobbyist machines assembled from scratch. The difference in price between a TRS-80 and an Apple II, measured in 2024 dollars, is approximately $3,600. For a working-class family in 1977, that gap was the difference between computing as something that might happen at home and computing as something that happened somewhere else. RadioShack had originally planned to produce 3,000 to 5,000 units annually. They sold more than 10,000 in the first month and a half. Total first-year sales exceeded 100,000 units, representing roughly half of all personal computer sales in the United States in 1978, according to a Smithsonian Institution record. The machine had been dramatically underestimated. The TRS-80 was in malls, in the same strip centers where families went to get shoes resold and pick up batteries. A child could walk past the store, see the display model, wander in, and type something on it. That was the democratizing moment. Not owning one, but touching one for the first time and understanding that it did what you told it to do. That a machine could be instructed. That you could be someone who gave instructions. One community account from Christmas 1982. TRS-80 with 32 kilobytes memory and extended BASIC saved my files to a cassette tape recorder. That sentence contains an entire childhood. The 32 kilobytes as a specification worth naming, extended BASIC as a genuine upgrade, the cassette recorder as the only storage medium available. These are the constraints of the era, rendered in the exact vocabulary of someone who grew up inside them. RadioShack supported the TRS-80 with teacher guides, course materials, and service infrastructure. A Computer History Museum archival brochure describes the machine as the most popular personal computer in the world and outlines the company's education support system alongside the hardware. Tandy published the Application Software Sourcebook across multiple volumes. This wasn't a hardware company bolting education on as an afterthought. This was a company that had been building educational infrastructure since 1969, applying that same philosophy to computing. The Smithsonian record puts the machine in its clearest context. TRS-80 on 5,000 RadioShack store shelves helped the Model 1 sell over 100,000 units during its first year, half of total PC sales in 1978. The store was the distribution system. The store was the reason it reached the people it reached. The CB radio craze of the mid-1970s was a RadioShack moment in a specific cultural sense. CB radio was a working-class technology. Truck drivers, farmers, rural residents, tradespeople communicating across distances. RadioShack stocked the equipment. RadioShack's sales were booming through the CB peak, and a father who ran a CB in his work truck and brought his kid to RadioShack on a Saturday wasn't visiting a specialty store outside his experience. He was on familiar ground. He could stand next to his kid in front of a wall of components and know what he was looking at. That mattered in a way particular to the working-class RadioShack customer. For a father without a college degree, RadioShack was one of the few technical spaces where his knowledge was the currency. He could explain a VOM, walk a kid through the components on a shelf, pick up a spool of hookup wire and describe what it was for. The store spoke his language. It stocked the things he understood, and it let him transmit that understanding to the next person in his family who needed it. The catalog extended this ritual across months and across the household. A family gave their address at the RadioShack counter, asked at every transaction, and the catalog arrived at home later. It sat on the kitchen table. It accumulated dog-eared pages. Christmas lists formed from it. A father and a kid could spend an evening paging through it together and argue about the 101 versus the 150-in-1, debate whether a realistic scanner was worth saving toward, measure the distance between what they had and what the next page described. People who remember RadioShack almost never describe a solo purchase. They describe a person who brought them there. An Archer kit assembled in the early 1970s appears in at least one documented community account, still functional decades later, kept not because it was practically useful, but because it was evidence. Evidence that the experience was real, that the transmission happened, that the store mattered. The store knew your address. It expected to see you again. The catalog was the ongoing conversation. The store was where the conversation continued in person. The house brands were the vocabulary of membership. Realistic, Micronta, Archer, Science Fair. If you knew those names and understood what they meant, you already understood what RadioShack was. Realistic and its successor brand, Optimus, were discontinued in 2000 as RadioShack's strategic identity shifted. That discontinuation was a signal, not announced as such, but readable in retrospect, as the moment the store's identity formally separated from its founding purpose. By the 1990s, without announcement, something had changed. Former employees who described the late era talk about internal metrics that no longer valued technical knowledge. Every call was about how many phones and how many accessories. The components section thinned. The VOM moved toward the back. The science fair kits held on longer than the broader shift would suggest, but the institutional priority had relocated. RadioShack filed for bankruptcy in 2015. By then, the company had operated for 94 years. The assets creditors most urgently wanted to protect were 117 million customer records, the accumulated name and address database built from decades of asking customers where they lived at the moment of purchase. The FTC and 38 state attorneys general intervened to limit the sale of that data. The catalog, the training program, the science fair brand, the culture of expertise. These weren't assets in a bankruptcy proceeding. They were already gone. How does something this good disappear so completely? The business answer is complicated. Big box competition, online retail, executive turnover, a mobile phone pivot that prioritized short-term volume over institutional identity. The grief answer is simpler. RadioShack tried to compete with Best Buy and the carrier stores on their terms, lost, and in trying, forgot what it had been. Nothing replaced it. The Maker movement built an online community. Adafruit and SparkFun serve hobbyists who already know what they're doing, but there's never been another chain with 7,000 locations where a 15-year-old with no background and no credentials could walk in off the street and encounter someone trained and financially incentivized to help them understand what they wanted to know. The infrastructure is gone. The gap it left is still there. Go back to East Tennessee. Zoom out from the one kid with the voltmeter and the catalog page. He's a data point in a pattern that ran the length and breadth of the country for 2 decades. Working-class neighborhoods in Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit. Small towns in rural Georgia and Kansas and Montana. Apartment buildings in Phoenix and Tucson. Farm communities scattered across the South and the Midwest. Everywhere a strip mall existed, a RadioShack could be within reach. And everywhere a RadioShack was within reach, a kid with the right kind of hunger could walk in without credentials and walk out with a beginning. RadioShack's architecture was precisely designed for this. 3,500 stores in 1977, 7,000 by the mid-1980s. An annual catalog mailed to anyone who'd ever given their address at the counter. No prerequisites, no zip code that disqualified you, no prior knowledge required to push through the door. The RadioShackCatalogs.com archive holds the record of what that meant year by year. The 1977 catalog with its 164 pages, the 1983 catalog at 184 pages, the editions that tracked CB radio through the craze and home computing through the revolution. Each one a year's worth of permission slips mailed to households across the country. The electronics teacher from East Tennessee who posted his origin story and found 117 people immediately recognizing their own history in it. He is the catalog's stated purpose made specific. Information and advice delivered through a paper catalog and a counter staffed by someone who'd passed a product certification within roughly 6 weeks of being hired and had profit sharing tied to getting the answer right. The system worked. The evidence is in what those kids became. Engineers and electricians, ham radio operators and software developers, electronics teachers and RF technicians. The comment sections of RadioShack retrospective videos are a census of the careers that passed through those stores. The people who showed up to write about it didn't come to do a post-mortem on a retail chain. They came to testify that it mattered, that it changed things, that the loss was real. RadioShack wasn't the golden age of consumer electronics. It was America's most democratic technical laboratory, disguised as a strip mall store with fluorescent lights and a flimsy door, and an employee who'd earned his way to knowing what a VOM was. It handed a generation their first vocabulary for understanding how the world works. Not the university generation, Not the already technical generation, but the generation that showed up from the parking lot with no prior claim on this knowledge and left with one. The lab is closed. The stories aren't. If RadioShack was your before and after, if there's a catalog page you still remember by feel, a kit that changed what you thought you were capable of, a Saturday morning with your father that you still measure other things against, put it in the comments. That's where those stories belong now, and that's where they'll find each other. Subscribe for more stories like this.